We started over the top at 6:10 a.m. and the Germans was putting their machine guns to work all over the hill in front of us and on our left and right. So I was in support, and I could see my pals getting picked off until it almost looked like there was none left. We got through the shells and the gas and occupied Hill 223, which was to be our jumping off place for the advance on the railroad. When the 0 hour came, we went over the top and started our advance. We had to charge across a valley several hundred yards wide and rush the machine gun emplacements on the ridge on the far side. And there were machine guns on the ridges on our flanks too. So you see, we were getting it from the front and both flanks. Well, the first and second waves got about halfway across the valley and then were held up by machine gun fire from the three sides. It was awful. Our losses were very heavy. Our boys just went down like the long grass before the mowing machine at home.
Sergeant Alvin York, 1918.
In the late 19th and early 20th century, the rapid development of firearms had led to shocking casualty rates in the various wars around the globe. The American Civil War, which saw so many advances in weaponry, saw over 600,000 Americans killed. But that was only a glimpse of things to come. By the end of World War I, more than 9 million soldiers would lose their lives. Another 21 million would be seriously wounded. For 3 long, bloody years, the war to end all wars was largely a European affair. But eventually, the U.S. would come to the aid of its traditional allies of Britain and France. American soldiers would discover the devastating power of the machine gun, which had been killing European soldiers by the hundreds of thousands. The machine gun defined the experience of World War I. The Americans had gotten the ball rolling on machine guns with the Gatling gun, used near the end of the Civil War. But although this was the first continuous firing gun, it was not truly an automatic weapon, as it required a person to turn a crank to load the cartridges. That changed with the 1884 invention of Hiram Maxim, an American-born British inventor. Maxim used the energy of the gun's recoil to eject the spent cartridge and insert the new one. This greatly reduced the labor of loading the gun compared with the hand-fed Gatling gun. It also reduced the gas buildup, allowing more bullets to be fired without overheating the barrel. The Maxim machine gun of 1884 could fire about 600 rounds per minute. That was 20 times more than even the SMLE Mark III, and far more than the slower loading rifles. But the power came at a cost in weight and portability. It took a team of men to move the gun and its mounting. Though one man could fire it, usually a crew of 5 would work the gun, with one firing while others assisted with identifying targets, preparing ammunition, and carrying water to cool the gun. Maxim partnered with Albert Vickers to form the Maxim Gun Company, which was eventually absorbed into the larger Vickers Company. The Maxim gun was originally used by British forces during colonial wars in Rhodesia, South Africa, and Nigeria. Armies were initially slow to adopt machine guns due to their tendency to jam. American forces continued to rely on the Gatling gun until finally abandoning it in 1911. But gradually, the armies of Europe and the American Navy began incorporating the machine gun into their forces. Many of these guns were variations on Maxim's 1884 gun. For example, the German Army's Maschinengewehr 08, or the MG08, was an adaptation of the Maxim gun. The MG08 and a lighter, more portable MG08-15 was the standard machine gun for German forces in World War I. The MG08-15 had an effective range of 2,200 yards, although it could reach almost 4,000 yards at the extreme. The gun had a 1-gallon jacket around the barrel which held the water to cool the gun. The MG08-15 could deliver devastating firepower, though with limited accuracy. Although it could fire up to 400 rounds per minute, generally, gunners would fire in short bursts. A 40-pound gun mounted on an 85-pound tripod, the MG08-15 was manned by a crew of 4. The British were using the Vickers machine gun, a variant of the Maxim gun produced by Vickers, which had absorbed the Maxim Gun Company. The Vickers gun became the primary machine gun of the British forces during World War I, though they still used some of the old Maxims. Improvements over the Maxim gun made it lighter and more portable. The gun itself weighed less than 30 pounds, the tripod another 20. When water was added to the cooling jacket, it added another 10 pounds. In all, still much lighter than the Maxims. The Vickers fired the same .303 caliber cartridge as the SMLE Mark III from a 250-round canvas belt. At a maximum fire rate of 500 rounds per minute, a single belt of ammo could be used up in 30 seconds. At the beginning of the war, the British military did not yet fully appreciate how the machine gun would change battle tactics. Each infantry battalion received just 2 of the Maxim machine guns, or Vickers if they were lucky. The guns couldn't be produced fast enough to fill all the units needing them. Experience in the war demonstrated to all combatants the importance of having machine guns manned by specialists, soldiers trained to load, fire, cool, and maintain machine guns. A single machine gun placed in a well-protected location could tear an infantry apart. And multiple machine gun nests with interlocking fields of fire could create an almost impenetrable defensive line. The Germans used the machine guns to provide a lethal defensive fire to support their Hindenburg Line, a vast network of German defenses in northeastern France. The Germans also built their famous machine gun pillboxes, as they were called by the British. The German pillbox was a miniature fort and provided another level of strength to the trench lines. The thick, reinforced concrete walls were almost impossible to crack, short of an artillery barrage. British forces seldom built machine gun pillboxes, but they and the Germans both prepared smaller machine gun posts, or nests. The British would eventually pull the heavy machine guns like the Vickers out of the infantry battalions and give them to a newly created machine gun corps. These specialists developed tactics for the machine gun, such as using them as a miniature artillery, firing them indirectly at unseen targets. They also identified how to fire their guns safely over the heads of friendly troops to clear a path for their advancing infantry. This use of machine gun barrage fire became a common tactic late in the war as the French and Germans picked it up from the British and used it themselves. But although the British had moved their heavy machine guns into the hands of the new Machine Gun Corps, they did not leave the infantry without automatic weapons of their own. The newly created Lewis machine gun was actually developed by a U.S. Army colonel with the ambitious name Isaac Newton Lewis. Lewis was unable to interest the U.S. Chief of the Ordnance Department in his gun, so he left the Army and the U.S. altogether, eventually working with the British Birmingham Small Arms Company Limited to produce his light machine gun. The Lewis gun weighed in at 28 pounds, about half the weight of the Vickers gun and tripod set. Its light weight meant that it could be carried and used by a single soldier rather than a crew. The gun used a drum pan magazine, which held 47 rounds. The Lewis gun could be produced at a much faster rate than the Vickers, providing the British Army with desperately needed firepower on the Western Front. Meanwhile, their allies, the French, were using an air-cooled machine gun, the Hotchkiss M1914. The Hotchkiss was gas-operated rather than recoil-operated like the various Maxim-style guns. It was sturdy and reliable and could be quickly produced in larger numbers. That was critical, both for the French and the U.S., because when the Americans entered the war, they wouldn't have enough machine guns of their own. The Hotchkiss was used extensively by the American Expeditionary Forces in France. American soldiers also used the French light machine gun, the Chouchou. The lightweight Chouchou was the most widely manufactured automatic weapon of World War I. Designed to be used without a tripod by a single gunner and assistant, the Chouchou could fire up to 240 rounds per minute, though its magazine held only 20 rounds. It was not intended to be used primarily as a defensive weapon, like the heavier machine guns, but to provide greater offensive firepower to the military. The American forces primarily had to use machine guns provided by their allies, primarily the Hotchkiss and the Chouchou. But late in the war, a small number of heavy machine guns designed by the legendary firearms genius John Moseph Browning made it to the front. Browning was one of the most highly regarded gunsmiths of the 20th or any other century, and designed a number of reliable, effective arms used by the U.S. during the war. The M1917 Browning machine gun was only issued to the last units shipping out to Europe, but it would prove its worth in World Wars I and II and continued to be used in Korea and Vietnam. The M1917 was a heavy machine gun, firing 450 30-06 cartridges per minute. For those units who received them, it replaced the Hotchkiss. Browning also made a light machine gun to replace the Chouchou that many found to be unreliable. Although, like the heavy M1917, it would see only limited use in World War I. The M1918 Browning automatic rifle, or BAR, would eventually become the backbone of U.S. forces in World War II and Korea. Weighing about 16 pounds, the BAR brought automatic firepower to the squad level. Although they didn't have the machine guns that would dominate much of the war, the American soldiers were armed with excellent rifles. In 1903, the U.S. military upgraded its service rifle, taking into account all they had learned from the M93 Mausers used against them in the Spanish-American War. This bolt-action rifle was chambered for a .30 caliber round, fired from a 5-round magazine. It would become the standard U.S. bolt-action rifle for World War I. The rifle was just under 45 inches long and weighed 8 pounds, 11 ounces. A model 1905 bayonet could be attached to the rifle, adding 16 inches of sharp steel and increasing the weight by a pound. The bayonet also had a 4-inch handle and could be used as a knife.
The 1903 Springfield is based largely upon the Mauser rifle. In fact, it's so similar to the Mauser system that Mauser filed suit against the U.S. government and ended up being paid royalties for the manufacture of this rifle. There are some differences. The 1903 has a different firing pin than the Mauser rifle. It replaced the Craig Jorgensen rifle because of lessons learned during the Spanish-American War. The U.S. soldiers felt outclassed by the Mausers that the Spanish troops were armed with because they could fire so much faster. The Spanish Mauser had an internal box magazine, which is what the Springfield here has. 5-round internal box magazine. You simply press down this follower here. There is a milled out portion in the receiver where you can place a charger clip, or a stripper clip as it's known, and this can be loaded and fired extremely quickly. It's a beautiful weapon, wonderfully made, very, very accurate, and this was produced and used right up through World War II. As a matter of fact, many of these Springfields found themselves used as sniper rifles up to the early stages of Vietnam. The .03 Springfield fires a 30 caliber cartridge, something you've heard, the 30-06 round. That in fact refers to a 30 caliber bullet developed in 1906. The .03 Springfield, when paired against the Mauser, they operate virtually the same. The ammunition for the .03 Springfield was updated in that they adopted a rounded boat tail bullet based upon what the Germans had developed for their 7.92 by 57 millimeter cartridge. It is different than the Mauser rifle that the Germans were armed with in World War I, the G98, in that it is short. This has only a 24-inch barrel. That's because at the time it was developed in 1903, this was intended to replace both the infantry weapon and the cavalry weapon, because there was a tendency to adopt a shorter carbine for both infantry and cavalry use.
One soldier who put this weapon to good use was a man that General Blackjack Pershing would later call the greatest single hero in the American forces. First Lieutenant Sam Woodfill was an expert marksman who had been hunting since the age of 10. He put his extraordinary talent to work clearing out machine gun nests. Woodfill and his regiment joined in the Argonne Offensive against the Hindenburg Line. The Hindenburg Line included trenches, concrete bunkers, and heavy belts of barbed wire, tunnels for troop movement, and deadly machine gun emplacements. The German High Command believed it could not be broken. Woodfill described the offensive as 46 days of rain and mud and death and general hell such as no American army had ever faced. In the early morning fog of October 12, 1918, Woodfill led his company in a long line toward the village of Cunel. As they crossed a field, the fog lifted and 3 machine gun nests let loose. While his men found cover, Woodfill took his rifle and began to stalk the machine gunners. He focused on the church tower first. He couldn't see the gunner, but he aimed behind the flash of the machine gun. He fired, and the machine gun was silenced. His next target was the abandoned stable. Again, the gunner was hidden, but again, Woodfill shot where the gunner should be, and the machine gun went silent. To reach the nest in the forest, he had to stalk around to the side, taking cover in holes created by shelling. One hole concealed a pocket of mustard gas, which he inhaled before realizing it. He avoided a fatal dose, but now his eyes were stinging and vision was blurry. Still, he moved on, creeping quietly until he was hidden from view, but in a spot where he could spy the face of the gunner in the third nest. Woodfill fired, and the man went down. Another took his place, and he fired again. Two more took up the machine gun, each killed by a single shot from Woodfill. Finally, the remaining two Germans fled. His men looked on with awe. Woodfill signaled them to move up. He then returned to the hunt. Each nest he cleared improved the odds of his men surviving that day. He found two more machine gun nests past Connell, and he took the five-man crew operating each with 5 well-placed shots. He was forced to dive into a trench when another nest opened up on him, and he found himself face to face with 2 German soldiers. Woodfill shot the first with his pistol, but when he turned to fire on the second, his gun jammed. Woodfill had taken out 5 machine gun nests, and the 2 Germans in the trench without taking an injury. But the exposure to the mustard gas took him out of the fighting. He and his men rejoined the rest of the American forces, but he was quickly moved to a hospital. And by the time he had recovered, the war was over. In February 1919, General Pershing, the commander of the U.S. forces in Europe, presented First Lieutenant Woodfill with the Medal of Honor. Facing Woodfill were Germans who, when not manning machine guns, were carrying bolt-action Mausers, labeled the Gewehr Model 1898, or the G98, the standard service rifle of the German Army. The G98 was designed by Peter Paul Mauser, whose earlier work had so impressed the Americans that they had copied it for their Model 1903. One of the most popular military and sporting arms ever developed, over 5 million G98 rifles were eventually produced. This well-built rifle was sturdy, powerful, and accurate. The G98 held a 5-round internal magazine and used an innovative controlled feed bolt action. The only complaint about the M98 was its slow rate of fire due to the design of the bolt and to the smaller magazine. No one made that complaint about the British standard arm, the short magazine Lee Enfield No. 1 Mark III. The SMLE could fire 30 to 40 rounds per minute in the hands of a trained soldier. The SMLE Mark III was the most recent in an extremely successful series of Lee Enfield rifles. The S in SMLE stands for short, indicating the shorter barrel, 25 inches, which made for a much lighter weapon. It fired the .303 caliber British cartridge. The standard rifle of the French was longer and heavier than the SMLE and slower to load, but it had a long history of service. The French Army's Lebel Model 1886 had been cutting edge 30 years earlier. Designed to take advantage of the then new invention of smokeless gunpowder, the Lebel had proven itself the superior of respected arms such as the 1871 Mauser. But by the time of World War I, it had become outdated. The Lebel 1886 was a bolt-action rifle firing an 8mm round from an 8-round magazine. Going the other direction from the SMLE Mark III, the Lebel was a long, heavy rifle and comparatively slow to reload. The slow loading was due to a serious design flaw. The Lebel's tubular magazine fitted each cartridge in a line, nose to tail. If one bullet's tip struck the primer base of the next bullet, it could explode inside the chamber. Recognizing the limitations of the Lebel Model 1886, the French introduced the Berthier rifle in 1907. The Berthier was a clip-loading rifle like the Enfields, providing a more modernized loading and firing system. But the 1907 model had only a 3-round clip, reducing the overall rate of fire considerably. The French military introduced a new model in 1916 with a 5-round clip. This was an obvious improvement, though some commanders preferred the 8-round Lebel 1886, which did remain the standard rifle of the French military during the war. Meanwhile, America needed more rifles of its own. The 1903 Springfields were excellent rifles, but there weren't enough of them to arm a military that had exploded in the wake of the Selective Service Act of 1917. In the years before America entered the Great War, the Winchester Repeating Arms Company and the Remington Arms Company contracted with Great Britain for the manufacture of the .303 caliber P-14 rifles. After the U.S. entered the war, the military needed rifles for its own soldiers. But rather than convert the Remington and Winchester factories to make the M1903 Springfields, which would take much more time, they decided to modify the British rifle design. The result was the M1917 Enfield, a gun patterned on the British rifle, but firing the standard U.S. .30-06 cartridges. Also called the American Enfield, this rifle was a couple of inches longer and about half a pound heavier than the M1903 Springfield. A model 1917 bayonet added about 16 inches and a little over a pound. The U.S. military quickly discovered that in trench fighting, a soldier needed a weapon that could provide a lot of power in a short range. The perfect weapon for this was the Winchester Model 1897 shotgun. The M1897 was a modification of the M1893, the first working pump-action shotgun. Another creation of legendary gunsmith John Browning, this weapon was so effective that the Germans protested that it violated the law of war. Unlike modern pump-action shotguns, the M1897 could be slam-fired, as the gun had no trigger disconnection. This means that when the soldier held the trigger back, he could fire the gun repeatedly and quickly by slamming the pump action. It gained the nickname Trench Sweeper. The Trench Sweeper could also use the M1917 bayonet, the same model used by the American Enfield, making it an even deadlier weapon in close quarters.
The Model 1897 shotgun is an improvement over the model of 1893 made by John Browning. This is a pump-action shotgun. This particular one is 12 gauge. Shotguns were first adopted for use against the Moros when we were fighting the Moros in the Philippines during the Philippine insurrection at the time of the Spanish-American War. We'd inherited the Philippines. They were a Spanish colony, and the Moros were a group. They were Muslims. These were people who would whip themselves up into a fervor. Oftentimes they would bind their limbs and extremities very tightly so that when fired upon, they wouldn't bleed out quickly and could inflict damage as much as possible. These were people who considered it a duty to kill the infidel, the occupiers of their nation. But the Model 1897 here is, like I mentioned, a pump-action shotgun. It works quite simply by using this wooden toggle underneath the barrel to pump an extra shot. Into the chamber, and you can actually pump fire these where you, between each shot, pump the action. You can fire these as quickly as possible. But the 1897, this particular one was made for World War I, and it does mount a bayonet here. It has a lug to accept the standard M17 bayonet, and so a shotgun with a mounted bayonet is extremely formidable within the confines of a trench. So much so that the Germans lodged a formal complaint over American use of the shotgun in the front lines. Nothing clears out a trench quite like a shotgun, a Model 1897 full of double-aught buckshot. Extremely effective.
The U.S. military also needed a powerful, reliable sidearm, and they were fortunate enough to be carrying one of the most widely regarded handguns in history. In 1907, the American military had held a series of controlled trials, searching for a semi-automatic handgun to replace the various revolvers currently in service. They selected the .45 caliber Colt Model 1911 with a 7-round detachable box magazine. The M1911 was designed by John Browning and is considered one of his best works. Introduced in 1911, it would be the standard issue sidearm for over 80 years. One of the most famous American soldiers to come out of World War I, Sergeant Alvin York, used an M1917 Enfield and an M1911 Colt pistol during the actions that earned him the Medal of Honor. But that's not to say that York loved his Enfield. He wrote in May 1918,
So we got to France at Le Havre. There we turned in our guns and got British guns. I had taken a liking to my gun by this time. I had taken it apart and cleaned it enough to learn every piece, and I could almost put it back together with my eyes shut. I didn't like the British guns so well. I don't think they were as accurate as our American rifles.
The British gun he referred to was the American M1917, patterned on the British Enfield P14. Regardless of his thoughts upon receiving his Enfield, York would prove its accuracy on October 8, 1918, during the Argonne Offensive, while he was still a corporal. York kept a diary throughout the war and described the events of that day.
This was our first offensive battle in the Argonne. We started over the top at 6:10 a.m. and the Germans was putting their machine guns to work all over the hill in front of us and on our left and right. So I was in support, and I could see my pals getting picked off until it almost looked like there was none left. We got through the shells and the gas and occupied Hill 223, which was to be our jumping off place for the advance on the railroad. When the 0 hour came, we went over the top and started our advance. We had to charge across a valley several hundred yards wide and rush the machine gun emplacements on the ridge on the far side. And there were machine guns on the ridges on our flanks too. So you see, we were getting it from the front and both flanks. Well, the first and second waves got about halfway across the valley and then were held up by machine gun fire from the three sides. It was awful. Our losses were very heavy. Our boys just went down like the long grass before the mowing machine at home. And to make matters worse, something had happened to our artillery and we had no barrage. So we decided to try and get them by a surprise attack in the rear.
York and 16 others from his battalion were working their way behind the German lines to try to take out the machine guns that were defending the line. They were able to overrun one German unit, capturing a large group of German soldiers. But while they were contending with the prisoners, they were sprayed by machine gun fire from a ridge beyond them. 9 men went down, 6 dead. Corporal York was the highest-ranking man left. York left his men to guard the prisoners and worked his way toward the German machine gun nest alone.
Those machine guns was spitting fire and cutting down the undergrowth all around me something awful. And the Germans were yelling orders. You never heard such a racket in all your life. I didn't have time to dodge behind a tree or dive into the brush. As soon as the machine guns opened up fire on me, I began to exchange shots with them. Every time I see a German, I just teched him off. At first I was shooting from a prone position, just like we often shoot at the targets in the shooting matches in the mountains of Tennessee. And it was just about the same distance, but the targets here were bigger. In the middle of the fight, a German officer and 5 men done jumped out of a trench and charged me with affixed bayonets. They had about 25 yards to come, and they were coming right smart. I only had about half a clip left in my rifle, but I had my pistol ready. I teched off the 6th man first, then the 5th, then the 4th, and so on. That's the way we shoot wild turkeys at home. You see, we don't want the front ones to know that we're getting the back ones, and then they keep on coming till we get them all. Of course, I hadn't time to think of that. I guess I just naturally did it. I know too that if the front ones wavered, or if I stopped them, the rear ones would done drop and pump a volley into me and get me. Then I returned to the rifle and kept right on after those machine guns. I hollered to them to come down and give up. I didn't want to kill anymore, and I had to. I'd take a couple of them off and holler again.
Faced with his growing losses, the German lieutenant commanding the unit called out in English to York, offering their surrender. York accepted. As a memorial, in the French village of Châtel-Chehery, states, armed with a rifle and pistol, he silenced a German battalion of 35 machine guns, killed 25 enemy soldiers, and captured 132. Originally, the M1911 was produced only by Colt, but with the advent of World War I, production expanded to the Springfield Armory, Remington, and other factories. Even that wasn't enough to meet the demand. To fill the gap, the U.S. contracted with Colt and Smith & Wesson for the production of .45 caliber 6-shot revolvers. The two companies each produced similar model 1917 revolvers. The Great War ended with the armistice signed on November 11th, 1918. With tens of millions dead or wounded, it seemed to many that it must truly have been the war to end all wars. But the seeds of World War II were sown in the treaties of World War I. A single generation later, war would again envelop the world. Americans would fight in Europe and the Pacific, trying to find peace at the point of the American gun and the evolution of the firearm.